Okay, what's going?
Yep.
All right, good. All right, thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. It's just a couple minutes after 7. And last week we did the first 8 chapters, the first half of Mark's Gospel, the first written account that we have still of Jesus' life and death. And tonight we'll do the second half. So welcome. We'll have more and more people coming as we gather. And again, remember, as we go along, if you have any questions, you can type them in. I can see them on the screen ahead of me. For last week, we started just a quick summary. In Mark, he starts with Jesus as an adult. We have the ministry of John the Baptist, who fulfills some passages from the Old Testament. Jesus is baptized by John. He's a quick account of temptation in the desert, and then he starts his traveling. He heals some people. Performs some miraculous healings. Anyway, it leads up to the experience at Caesarea Philippi when Jesus says to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They give some answers about what people are saying about him. And then he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And that is the climax of the first half of the gospel. We are asked, "Who do you say Jesus is?" Peter speaks on behalf of the apostles and says, "I believe you're the Messiah," but he doesn't know what that means. Nobody does, obviously. Jesus then talks for the first time about whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And that is the conclusion of the first half of Mark's Gospel. So tonight we will do the second half, so beginning with chapter 9. The first main thing that happens in chapter 9 is the transfiguration. So that is mentioned in all the Gospels. Or anyway, for those who weren't here last time, at the beginning, if there's ever a little letter before a passage, that means that it's in other places as well. So when it says in my Gospel, in my Bible, right before chapter 9, verse 2, there's a little letter Z, which says Matthew 17, 1 to 13, Luke 9, 28 to 36. So that tells us where in those Gospels the same passage is. So 6 days after Jesus has been identified as the Messiah by his apostles, although they don't know what being the Messiah means yet, he takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain. All right, Peter, James, and John are always with Jesus whenever anything really, really important happens. He takes them with him when he performs a miracle, often when he raises somebody from the dead. Here, it's the story of the Transfiguration, where his clothes become dazzling white, a cloud comes over, they see Elijah and Moses. The significance of Elijah and Moses is to tell us that Moses is the law of the Old Testament. Elijah is the most known of the prophets of the Old Testament. Both Moses and Elijah approve of Jesus, therefore Jesus is both law and prophet. Many times Jesus had even said, this summarizes the law and the prophets. The law is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in which Moses is a significant character. The prophets, many of them in the Old Testament, but Elijah the most known of them. So Jesus fulfills both law and prophets. That is seen by the representation of both Moses and Elijah with him on this mountain. And then, it's not just Moses and Elijah, it's not just law and prophets that affirm Jesus. Also a voice says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." So Jesus is confirmed by God, and the message to us is, listen to him. We are supposed to listen to what Jesus has to say. So the Transfiguration is a special appearance that Peter, James, and John have, but Jesus is law and prophet. Listen to him. And from there, then, Jesus starts his journey toward Jerusalem. The apostles don't understand everything. They don't know what rising from the dead means. Hey, we wouldn't either. They ask him about, what's this about Elijah coming first? Elijah is supposed to come before the Messiah. There's a couple places in here that Jesus says he did. That was John the Baptist. That John the Baptist fulfilled the role of Messiah in being the one to come right before the Messiah. The next thing that happens is Jesus asked them about what they were arguing about, and then there's this issue with a demon or a mute spirit. And Jesus is a little frustrated and says that they don't have enough prayer or whatever, they don't have enough faith to answer this. A major theme of Mark's gospel is trust in God. And regularly throughout they talk about how the apostles and many of the people who did know Jesus very well did not have that amount of trust. Mark writes the gospel in a way to ask us, how about you? Do you have enough trust in Jesus? So anyway, he says everything is possible to one who has faith, and he performs another miracle. Right after that, Jesus has the second of his three predictions of the Passion. Several predictions of Jesus in Mark's Gospel, and I'll talk about those regularly, but the main one is the one about the impending suffering and death in Jerusalem of the Son of Man. So here again he says, the Son of Man will be handed over, they will kill him, 3 days after his death he will rise. They don't know what that means. Obviously, we wouldn't have known either if we were there. Then, as they come to Capernaum, he asks them again, what were you arguing about? And they don't respond because they were arguing about who is the greatest. All right, so Mark again wants to tell us who gives the best example here that we're supposed to follow. Well, sometimes it's these people who come to Jesus in faith and ask for healing. They seem to have more faith than Jesus' followers do. Anyway, Jesus says that if anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all. So I used to ask that as a test question when I taught. According to Jesus, who's the greatest person in the classroom? Well, people could throw out different answers, but if they read this passage, then the answer is the one who serves the most. Jesus says, if you want to be great, you need to be a servant of all, not be afraid to be the last of all, the servant of all. And then he talks about receiving a child. If you receive a child, you receive not only me, but also the one who sent me. So children are mentioned because children are often very trusting. And we are called to be trusting like children are when it comes to our relationship and our dependence on God. The apostles say someone's driving out demons in your name. Jesus says that's okay. If they're not against us, they're for us. He has the thing about the temptation to sin. If someone causes another to sin, it would be better if a millstone were thrown around their neck and then thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, cut it out. All those things meaning you are better off without the things that lead you to sin and winding up in the kingdom of God than you are keeping the things that lead you to sin and winding up in Gehenna. So whatever it is that causes you to sin, get rid of it. Whatever temptation you have in life, whatever temptation it is that leads you to sin, get rid of that. You're better off without that and winding up in heaven than you are keeping it and winding up in Gehenna where the worm doesn't die and the fire isn't quenched. The garbage area outside of the city is referenced in that place where the things are burned. Terrible place. It's our analogy for hell. You don't want to be there. So whatever it is as it causes you to sin, you're better off without that. That is the meaning of that particular passage. In chapter 10, we do have Jesus giving a very strict interpretation of marriage and how it is supposed to be a perpetual relationship. There are 5 times in the New Testament where the account of a man leaving his father and mother and joining his wife, that passage from the book of Genesis is quoted 5 times in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have Jesus quoting that passage. The other 2 are Paul's letter, quoting Jesus quoting that passage. So anyway, a Pharisee says, is it lawful for a husband to divorce his wife? And they were testing him again. And Jesus says, what did Moses say? And they say, well, he permitted it. And Jesus says, well, the reason he permitted it is because people of his time kind of talked him into that. But what I say is, and then he quotes from Genesis, from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, the man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two become one. What God has joined, no human being must separate. So Jesus is very strict on that. He says that's the way it was in the beginning, and it was only due to outside influence that Moses was convinced to change that. The apostles are perplexed by that too. They think maybe Jesus is speaking a little bit too much here. So they, when they're in private, just Jesus and the apostles, they ask him again, basically, are you sure about that? You know, were you just exaggerating there to make a point? And he says, no. No, he says, whenever anyone divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. And if she does it, she does the same. So that part is worth noting too, because for the most part, it was men that convinced Moses that it was okay for a man to divorce his wife, not the other way around. So here Jesus puts the man and woman on equal footing in responsibility, that they're both responsible for being faithful to their spouse, to the vows that they made. And when the apostles ask him, are you sure that's what you mean? He definitely says yes. He affirms it again. That probably tells us that that was an issue in the early Christian community, and the writers of the Gospels and Paul, all of them, wanted to make sure that their audiences knew what Jesus taught. So they all have that account. And later on, Matthew has a little bit of an exception to it, a smaller one. And anyway, today, if we wanted to talk about annulments and remarriage, we could, but that would take a while. That's another issue. But later on in the Matthew's Gospel and in one of Paul's letters, they give a little exception in there. And today in our church, by the way, an annulment doesn't say that a marriage never took place. It said a marriage did happen, it was legal, but there was something missing so that it wasn't sacramental, and therefore the party can get married again. But the reason that we just don't do what the state does and say, okay, marriage is over, you're divorced, you're free to marry again, is because Jesus didn't say that. So we have to take these words of Jesus very seriously, and using those exceptions that Matthew and Paul gave, we make room for an annulment from a pastoral perspective. But we do want to maintain loyalty to what Jesus said, and that's why we don't just do divorces really simply and quickly, because Jesus didn't. So, besides marriage, Jesus is also very strict on something else, and that is the idea of possessions and how important they may be. So it says that as they're going along, someone comes up and says, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, well, what are the commandments, right? He gives a couple, for example, just to see what the guy is going to say. And he says, yep, I've done all those. I've done all those. And sometimes I say that a lot of times when people do reconciliation for their examination of conscience, they'll go through the 10 Commandments. And I guess that's fine, but for Jesus, I mean, that's just the beginning. That's almost like easy stuff. I mean, you're supposed to follow those pretty easy. He gives us a little higher expectation. So when the man says, yeah, I've followed the 10 Commandments that you're talking about, no problem, he's expecting Jesus to say, well, you're doing very good then, you're in great shape. That should be good. But that's not what Jesus says. Instead, he says, you're lacking in one thing. Sell what you have and give it to the poor. Then you'll have treasure in heaven. Then you can come and follow me. And it's also very interesting, not only the fact that Jesus said that, but what does the man do? He leaves. He leaves. And Jesus does not run after him and say, okay, wait a minute, all right, I was exaggerating there. Or wait a minute, all right, it's not quite that difficult. He doesn't do that. He allows the man to leave because he cannot part with his possessions. So, Mark asks us how valuable our possessions are to us. Are they so important? Are they more important than following Jesus? In the case of this person, the answer would be yes, they were. And he left sad, and Jesus allowed him to leave sad because his possessions were that important. So Jesus makes his point and makes the same question to us. Are we willing to live without so many possessions? Much more so today because we have so many more possessions than the people of Jesus' time did. But how valuable are they to us? Are they more important than our relationship with Jesus? If so, then we walk away sad too. So regularly throughout the gospel, Mark gives us examples of good people to follow and people that aren't the best to follow. So here the Pharisees trying to come up with excuses for why it's okay to divorce a wife. Jesus says, nope, not so easy. And a person who's convinced of his own righteousness says, yeah, I follow the 10 Commandments, that should be good enough. And Jesus says, no, it isn't. So those were two people who thought pretty highly of themselves that Jesus does not give particular credit to. Instead, it's to the trusting, the childlike, those who come to him in faith, asking for help. Those seem to be the heroes, at least up to this point. For us, we might feel pretty discouraged by that passage because probably all of us watching in here are going to say, well, I have an awful lot of possessions. I have way more possessions than this man probably did 2,000 years ago. So am I in trouble? And even the apostles say that to Jesus. They say, well, then who can be saved? Can anybody be saved? And Jesus simply said, well, it's not possible for people, but all things are possible for God. So again, if we place our faith in God, then yep, we are still able to be part of his kingdom. Then he reminds his apostles, who are almost saying, like, we left our homes to follow you. We left our business to follow you. And he says, yes, I know that. And anyone who's given up family or property or anything else for the sake of the gospel will be rewarded much more in the times to come. And again, many that are first will be last, and the last will be first. So we have those accounts in chapter 10 of the explanation of Jesus' teaching on marriage and divorce and his teaching on possessions. Then, for the third time, Jesus predicts what's going to happen in Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem is the main city. It's where most of the things regarding the prophets in the Old Testament took place. To do something significant, you almost have to get to Jerusalem sometime. So Jesus is talking about how he's going to go there and again be handed over to the chief priests and scribes who will condemn him and be put to death. And again, this part about 3 days later he will rise, which, again, nobody can know what that means. Mark definitely puts the apostles in a negative light sometimes. Probably just to remind us that even the closest followers of Jesus weren't perfect, and they had human ambition and emotions too. And many times Mark gives us examples of characters and says, look at some of their character traits. Know which ones are good that you should have, and know which ones that are bad that you shouldn't have. So here it's the self-righteousness of the Pharisees. They think they know the law so well. No, don't be self-righteous. Then it's the rich man who's attached to his possessions. Jesus says, no, don't be greedy, don't be attached to your possessions. And then third, it is the ambition of two of his best friends, James and John. They have apparently some ambition because they say to Jesus, we want to sit at your right and your left when you come in glory. So in other words, when you do manifest yourself as king, when you do come into power, we want to be two of your main assistants. And Jesus says, well, gee, do you even know what you're asking? Can you drink from the cup that I drank, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am to be baptized? And they say, yeah, we can, but they don't know what that all entails. So Jesus goes on and talks about how I can't say that, who's going to be on right and left. Don't know that. But what I do know is that I don't want you to be like the Gentiles who like to lord their power over other people. It should not be that way with you. Rather, If you want to be great, you will be a servant. Whoever wishes to be first will be the slave of all. I didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So 3 traits that we are to avoid according to chapter 10. Self-righteousness, like the Pharisees. Attachment to possessions or greed, like the rich man. And selfish ambition, as in the case of 2 of his closest friends, James and John. So instead, be a servant. Instead, don't be afraid to be a slave of others. Be a servant of other people. That is what's most important to Jesus. Not greed, not possessions, not ambition. Someone who's a good example is the final character from chapter 10, this man named Bartimaeus. And as they're going through Jericho, this blind man hears that Jesus is coming through and says, "Have pity on me." People apparently tell him to be quiet, but he keeps calling out all the more. And Jesus tells him, "Well, bring this guy over here." And then they say, "All right, bring him over." And Jesus says, "What do you want?" And he says, "I want to see." And Jesus rewards his faith. So whereas the disciples and many significant people in society are struggling to understand who Jesus is and struggling what Jesus' expectations are, some common people catch on. Anyway, common people have this great trust. So here it is in this case of Bartimaeus, who has got faith in Jesus and says, "I know that you can heal me. I want to see. Help me to do that." So anyway, why are there so many mentions of the passions? Well, 3 times. Many times in Scripture, things happen in 3s. So this is one of them. But again, it's not really to show that they're stubborn or anything. No, it's just because who was going to believe this? The expectations were that Jesus was going to be a king. So when he's talking about being handed over and put to death, they don't get that. And I'd say we wouldn't have either. But Mark mentions it 3 times to tell us that yes, it was regularly mentioned by Jesus, but his followers didn't get it. And maybe a few others do. So that was in response to one question. Another one is, where does the Son of Man phrase come from? Well, it's mentioned a few times in the Old Testament, primarily in the book of the prophet Ezekiel. A huge majority of the times that it's used in the Old Testament is from Ezekiel. Son of Man is someone who does God's will, someone who is faithful to God. So Jesus does use that term to refer to himself and to, that's what we are called to do as well. In the Old Testament, Son of Man was meant, okay, we're not gods, we're below that, but we are called to be faithful to God. We're called to try to do God's will. So that is what the Son of Man should do, and that's probably what the interpretation Jesus had when he borrows it from Ezekiel and other people that used it in the Old Testament. He definitely uses it regularly, and it does talk about a Son of Man who will come in power even. And as time goes on, we'll see more about what that might mean. So we got 10 chapters down and 6 to go. Well, the last 6 deal with the last week of Jesus' life. So 6 of the 16 chapters deal with 1 week. Some people say, the first 10 chapters are just a long introduction to the key part here about what Mark wants to tell us. So for 10 chapters, Mark goes through some of the highlights, some of the key things from Jesus' public ministry. Again, not much on teachings, only a couple of parables. We'll hear more about parables next week. But he does talk about what Jesus did. He talks about his miracles. Some of his main teachings, doesn't have to do with a lot of words, but chapter 10, 3 main teachings there. Now he's going to come into Jerusalem. You've heard maybe the little village of Bethany and the Mount of Olives. That's right, just a couple of miles on the edge of town there where they go through. And Jesus gives the instructions to his apostles on Palm Sunday. Before we begin the regular Mass, so the Mass often begins in the back of church, and we read the first gospel of that day, the only day that we read a gospel in the back of church and then the regular gospel during the Mass. But we read the one about Jesus giving instructions to his apostles about going into town and finding this colt and so on and what they're supposed to do with it. What that probably tells us is that Jesus knew that there was going to be some trouble. So he's probably made some arrangements with some friends that he has in town so that they're going to have some things ready for him. Because we do know that he's got a place ready for the Last Supper on Thursday night. And we do know that he's got arrangements on this colt that will be bringing him to town. So they get that. And then it says that as they go in, they say, Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which we say, that's where we get that for what we do during Mass every day. Hosanna in the highest. So praise God. We're very happy. This is the one that we've heard so much about. And the palm branches, okay, all that, because they're really expecting things. Now, if you lived in Jerusalem back then, yeah, you didn't know who Jesus was, maybe. There weren't any things like pictures or anything back then. So unless you've seen him in person, you don't know what Jesus looks like. You have heard about what he said. You've definitely heard a lot about what he's done. And there's a lot of excitement and anticipation as he comes into Jerusalem. There is talk that maybe this person is the Messiah. And remember, for most people then, Messiah was going to be probably a political, maybe military figure, someone who was going to restore the kingdom to Israel, someone who would get them free of Roman control, much more political than religious or spiritual. So that is the excitement that Jesus elicits as he comes into the city. One thing I was never sure of was it says that he curses a fig tree. I didn't know exactly how that fit in there. He sees a fig tree, doesn't have anything on it, so he says, no one ever eat your fruit again. Well, what most people say is that fig tree often in the Old Testament is a symbol of Israel. So it is later on symbolic of that Israel has failed. They have failed to be fruitful. They have failed to bear a harvest as far as listening to Jesus goes. When they go into Jerusalem, Jesus is going to do a few things that would understandably get some significant people upset at him. One is what we call the cleansing of the temple. He goes in and overturns the money tables and so on. Now, there were stages of significance as you enter the temple area. It's really a fascinating thing to do if you want to look it up sometime online. Just go Temple Mount, and it'll give you the history of it. But it is the most holy place in the world for Jews of that time, and still is today. A quick history of it. All right, when the Jews had the Ark of the Covenant, they just traveled with it throughout the desert. It wasn't until David got the city of Jerusalem under his control that he built his home there, and then his son Solomon built a place for the ark, and it was called the temple. It was the frontmost part of the temple, which people only entered once a year. And eventually the temple was used for other things, especially for sacrifice. Anyway, that temple was there for centuries, but as you remember from Old Testament, it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And about 50, 60 years later, the Jews came back home, and the prophet said, let's get that rebuilt. So they did that. And it's been there again now. The Second Temple's been there for centuries. And one thing that Herod did, he was known for a lot of bad things, but he was known for being a builder. And during Herod's time, they really built up this temple area that becomes not just the temple building itself, but the Temple Mount, the whole area around it. And if you ever go to Jerusalem today, you can see all that. If you ever see a report from Jerusalem on TV, you always see the Temple Mount area. In the background is this huge mosque that you can see in the distance called the Dome of the Rock. In the front, they usually report from the Western Wall, which is the last part which remains from this second temple. About the time that Mark's Gospel is written, this temple is destroyed. And as I'll say at the end again, as I said last week, that's really significant to know. That's one of the key events of the New Testament. Anyway, at this time, Jesus goes there. There's an outer area where everybody can gather and talk, okay? Then there's a place where you can exchange money because there's different currencies. So even today, When I was in Israel back in 1985, the first thing we did when we got there is we had to take our dollars and exchange them for shekels, the local currency. Same thing goes for back at this time, so that's what the money changers were. That was they needed to be there for that particular purpose, so you could use the local currency. Anyway, they're doing some other things there too, but the close farther in you go, then you go up steps, you get into where it's a little holier, and then only Jews can go beyond this spot. Later on, Paul is going to get in trouble for having, I believe, Timothy with him too far into the temple. He's accused of bringing a Gentile into the temple area. So anyway, it is the holiest place, and Jesus clears people out and says it's supposed to be a house of prayer, and you've made it into other things. So people are going to be very displeased with the fact that he makes such a scene at the temple. Later on, they have the continuation of the story about the fig tree having withered. Probably put in here that just as the temple is destroyed in the year 70, there's no more sacrificing, the cursing of the fig tree, and the withering of the fig tree probably is a reminder of that, maybe even a representation of that. That yes, the temple worship, the temple sacrifice, things that are so associated with Jewish faith are gone. And historically, when you talk about biblical Israel, you're talking about Israel of the Bible. As a country, it goes back to the time of Saul, David, Solomon, but it ends in the year 70, because that's the year that the temple is destroyed and the Jews are thrown out of the Holy Land for the most part. There are a few that remain for a little while, and in 135, the last ones are thrown out again, and Jerusalem is destroyed again. So the time of biblical Israel comes to a close at around the time that Mark is writing his gospel. Then the next thing that people question Jesus' authority, a regular theme in the Gospels is Jesus' opponents regularly try to entrap him with questions, but he always comes back and makes them speechless. This is the case here too. They're going to ask him a question about whose authority is able to do the things that he does. In exchange, he asks them a question about John the Baptist. They can't answer it because either way they answer it, they'll get into trouble, so they say they don't know, so Jesus outsmarts them again. Parable of the tenants. This is another thing that's going to get people very upset. So this is a parable, again, where everything makes sense as it's told, but everything represents something else. So Jesus says that a man builds a vineyard, puts a lot of work into it, and leases it out to tenant farmers and goes away. He sends servants to the tenants to obtain his share. They don't give it to him. They beat him up instead, send him away. He sends in another servant. They beat them up too. They send in more servants. Some of them they even kill. Finally, he sends in a third attempt, his son, and they kill him too. So what's the owner of the vineyard going to do? And they say, well, I suppose he'll put the tenants to death and make sure he gets his share of the produce. Anyway, this is a story to tell us that 3 different times God tried to appeal to the people of Israel. Just like in the story here, 3 times the owner sends people to the tenants to get his share. The first attempt is Moses, so the law. The first time that God tries to help his people to live better, he gives them the law, but no, they don't follow it very well. So he makes a second attempt. He sends more people than the first. He sends the prophets. He sends the prophets to specifically give God's message to them. Yeah, it doesn't work either. They even kill some of them. So now God makes a third attempt. He sends his own son, hoping that they'll listen to him. But as Jesus correctly forecasts, no, they won't listen to him either. And instead, they even have him put to death. So that son will wind up being the cornerstone, though. So anyway, he's telling the Jews that 3 times you failed to listen to God. Our ancestors failed to listen to the law. Different ancestors failed to listen to the prophets, and now this generation fails to listen to God's Son. So you can see why they don't like that particular parable. Another one, they have the question, they're trying to trip Jesus up again with other questions, so they ask him one about paying taxes. In one of the Gospels, they even talk about how that's one of the untrue, unfounded charges they bring against Jesus is, he said not to pay taxes. Not true. Because when they ask him, is it lawful to pay the tax or not? he says, well, whose image is that on the coin? And they say Caesar. Then Jesus gives that famous answer, repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. So in other words, his answer is, yeah, we pay our taxes because, yeah, there are things that we need government to do. So we all pay our share for that. But don't forget, you also give to God what belongs to God. So today we would say that's church and charity. So don't forget that. So Jesus never says not to pay taxes because when you're part of a country, in this case an empire, the empire taxes everybody. And in order to provide some of the services that they do, you have to do that. So that's Jesus' answer, but don't forget to give to God what belongs to God. Again, a regular theme in all the Gospels. People bring questions to Jesus in the hope of tripping him up, but he always gives an answer that instead trips them up. The next one is the one, the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. Sadducees did not believe in resurrection, did not believe in afterlife, didn't believe in angels, that sort of thing. Pharisees did, and the Pharisees and Sadducees often argued over that. So that's why it's kind of significant to know who is it that's asking Jesus a question. If it's Pharisees, it's because they're trying to get something in the law that they don't think Jesus is following right. If it's Sadducees, they're probably thinking it's Jesus' teachings aren't right. So anyway, they say, well, what if you have more than one spouse while you're here on earth? Who are you going to be married to if there's an afterlife? And Jesus' answer is, well, you're just not thinking along the right way. Go back to, in Scripture, in our Old Testament, it talks about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Those people have been dead for centuries, but we still talk about them because God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. So your question isn't significant. Instead, God is the God of all, both the living here on earth and those who have gone before us. God of all those. They are still living in God's kingdom. Then, to sum up what Jesus teaches, somebody comes to him and says, what's the first of all the commandments? And again, some of us might say, okay, 10 commandments, but no, it's 613. Somebody comes up to ask him that. A scribe, scholars of the law, these are people that might know all 613 of them. So they ask Jesus, what is the greatest of them? Because they're thinking Jesus probably doesn't know them all, so maybe he won't give the greatest answer. His first one, though, is they accept pretty well. Hear, O Israel, Lord our God is Lord alone. Love God with your whole heart, soul, mind, and all your strength. That's even a prayer called the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. So, no surprise that Jesus would say that. Many Jews would probably agree that is the first and greatest of all the commandments. God is one, and God is worthy of all worship. They even put that on their foreheads and on their wrists, and so that they'll never forget that. So no surprise that Jesus would say that. But he does add a second one, which is very important, and that is, he says, there's a second one, just as important. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. No commandment greater than this. So love is the great commandment. We really can't show our love for God if we do not love our neighbor. And also by neighbor, we're saying not just physically a person who lives next to us or a fellow Jew or someone who's just like us. Jesus' other teachings go to talk about how neighbor is extended to everyone else. So, two great commandments. First one, no surprise. Second one, yeah, major surprise. And for us as Christians, we maybe aren't surprised by that because it's mentioned so often by Jesus and by his followers. But I will tell you, that phrase is only mentioned once in the entire Old Testament, in Leviticus 19:18, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself. And there are times where, yeah, neighbor meant, yeah, your fellow Jew, not other people. So Jesus has this as the basis for everything that he teaches. It says everything is based on these two. Everything is based on these two. So, quickly, there's a question on the Sadducees and Pharisees. Are the different levels in the Jewish religion? No, they're almost more like political parties, but they do have religious beliefs that are different. Sadducees were more of the upper class. Many of them were okay with the Roman occupation of Israel because they were doing fine. They were like the aristocracy. They were well-to-do. So they were content with the way things were, but they were very strict in what they believed. They believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, but that was about it. Did not have a belief in things like resurrection or angels, whereas the Pharisees did have the entire, what we now call the Old Testament. They did believe in some of these other things, but they believed that they were the ones who should interpret the law for everybody else, that they had more knowledge than the common people did. And remember, the Sadducees and Pharisees were a limited number of people. So the Pharisees thought, yeah, common people need us to explain Scripture to them and to tell them what they need to do with sacrifice and all their other forms of worship. Then Jesus again talks about humility. He says, when you don't be like the people who love to wear the long robes and have the greetings and the places of honor and all that. No, that's not what you should be like. No. And what should you be like? We follow that up with the story of the poor widow. They're in the temple. They see people putting in their regular collections, kind of like we do. Well, we don't now because we don't have Mass, but we still need collections. So anyway, they're putting in their contributions into the treasury to take care of the temple and other expenses. People put in decent amount. This poor widow only puts in a couple of coins, but Jesus says, that's what I want you to be like. She really can't afford to give, but she does anyway because she wants to. The other people that gave because they had surplus. It was a thing to do. It was kind of expected of them. Don't know if they were real genuine or not. But we do know this woman was. She gave because she wanted to, and it's not from her surplus because she didn't have a surplus. So we are reminded when we give, it shouldn't be just because it's surplus, it should be because we want to. So just as throughout, we've heard different people, unnamed people in the story, who are kind of heroes or good examples. Okay, here again, Mark tells us this woman is a great role model. Who are the great role models? You know, it's often unnamed people in this story. All right, chapter 13 I am going to go through pretty quickly because it's an example of apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic is like referring to end times or future times, but in all likelihood very symbolic. And this is pretty much the only chapter in Mark that's that way. The book of Revelation is apocalyptic. The book of Daniel in the Old Testament is apocalyptic, using symbols to refer to other things. Jesus tells us some things here that are important, though. But remember, when I gave the introduction, I said that this gives us a time period for when Mark was written, when Jesus sees these great stones and buildings and says, one day there will not be one stone that won't be thrown down. So again, Mark has Jesus making many predictions that do come true. That is one that does happen. We do know exactly the year that it happened, in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. So we have a foretelling of that. We have things about there are always going to be earthquakes and famines and all these other things and wars. People that say they know when the end is going to be, yeah, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that, everybody. There's always going to be wars and insurrections and now a pandemic. I mean, those things have happened throughout history. A lot of times when they happen, somebody says, oh, yep, this is the beginning of the end. It's foretold in scriptures or whatever. But no, Jesus himself says these things always happen. Doesn't mean it's going to be the end. As a matter of fact, no one knows when the end will be. But what you should do is be ready for when it comes. So he talks about this coming persecution. He says, you'll be beaten in synagogues. They'll hand you over to courts. Yes, families will be divided because some will believe in Jesus and some will not. You'll be hated because of my name. But if you persevere, you'll be saved. So it's encouragement. And this does tell us that not only was there some persecution of Christians in Jerusalem, but there was in Rome as well, which is where many people believe Mark wrote his gospel. Peter and Paul were executed in Rome in the 60s, and so were many, many, many other good Christians. So many people believe Mark is writing this to give inspiration to those people who are facing great persecution, saying that so did Jesus, and he told us that we would too. So this is to be expected. Persevere. So be prepared, be ready for the coming of the end, because the end of our lives might come at any time, but we don't know when the total end will be. So that is what chapter 13 is about. So we need to finish off here the last 10 minutes, the last few chapters. Chapter 14 is the Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread was going to take place. We have the story of this woman who anoints Jesus' feet with her hair. It's a reminder, yes, we are supposed to help the poor, but again, she is a great example of her great trust that she has in Jesus. Then it says one of the 12, Judas, goes off and asks what he can get for betraying Jesus, and they offer him an amount of silver, so he's going to do that. And then we prepare for the Passover. So this is Thursday night, and the Passover is the most important meal of the year for Jews, and still is today. It celebrates the beginning of their escape from slavery in Egypt. So Jews always remember that. They do a meal the way it's explained to do back in the book, in the Torah, when it explains how to do that. So Jesus and his apostles are practicing Jews. They are commemorating the Passover. Jesus again has something set up. He says, go into the city. You'll see a man carrying a jar of water. That's the guy you follow. He's going to have a place for us where we'll have our meal. So they do that. So Jesus has made arrangements that way. And then, while they're at the supper, extremely important for all of us as Christians, every Mass at the Catholic Church, I quote the words of Jesus at his Last Supper. So, first of all, he says, one of the 12 is going to betray him. They all say, no, not me. Can't believe that. Won't be me. But then, bread is part of the meal, and the leader broke bread and distributed, but Jesus says something different besides the regular blessing. He says, take this. This is my body. And then later on, wine is part of the meal. 3 different times where they drink wine during the Passover meal. And he says, drink this. This is the blood of the covenant, which will be shed for many. I won't drink the fruit of the vine again until I drink it new in the kingdom of God. So the old covenant is the one made on Mount Sinai, sealed with the blood of the lambs. They sacrificed lambs and sprinkled the blood of the lambs on people as a reminder of how serious this covenant was. And in the Passover, it's the blood of the lamb on the doorpost that saves the Jews on the Passover. So Jesus says this is the blood of the new covenant. The new covenant. So this is a new and everlasting one. We are saved by the blood of Jesus. The next day, the apostles again don't know it this night, but will be saved again. Will be saved by his blood the next day. And then he makes this prediction that all of you will be scattered, and eventually all 12 of them do run away and hide. And he tells his closest friend, Peter, you'll deny me 3 times. So again, all these predictions of Jesus coming true later on, except for a couple at the very end that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Somebody asked, was Judas predestined to betray Jesus? Well, if you read John's gospel, it sounds like the answer is yes. If you read Mark's gospel, it's like the answer is no. We believe in free will. That was one of the things, the first time I really studied John's gospel in depth, that really bothered me. I mean, because it sounds like Judas is only doing what he's supposed to do. So anyway, as time went on, the writers believe that that's the way God intended it to happen, and that it had to happen that way. However, knowing that it was going to happen that way doesn't cause it to happen that way, if that makes sense. So Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him, but that didn't cause Judas to betray him. That's the best I can answer that. That's just an excellent question, because the whole idea of free will, or does God make us do what we do, or not. Predestination, that even came up as one of the things talked about 1,500 years later in the Reformation. But anyway, Mark for sure would say no, Judas chose to do that. Later on, John gives a little bit different interpretation. Hopefully that's, in just a quick minute here, that's the best answer for now. Jesus goes out, he prays, he gets arrested. The apostles can't stay awake even. He's arrested. It's Judas leads them there. Again, people didn't know what Jesus looked like, so they need Judas to point him out. Jesus says, let the other guys go. And he's brought to the Sanhedrin. They ask him a few questions at night, which we read on Palm Sunday and again on Good Friday. They ask him some questions. I do give Peter some credit. He stays by, maybe thinking maybe there's something I can do here. The other guys have all run away. So out of the 12 apostles, 1 betrayed Jesus, 10 ran away. Peter's the only one there. So I give him credit for that. But when he's asked, are you with him? No, he says 3 times. He says no. Jesus himself does not say much during his interrogation, and I suppose one reason is his friends, his witnesses, aren't there to hear what he did say, if he did say much. But the one answer that Jesus gives that condemns him is when he says, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." That is considered to be blasphemy when he equates himself with the Messiah or the Son of the Blessed One. No, that's blasphemy, basically claiming to be God. So when he does that, the high priest tears his garments, which means, I've just heard something really terrible. This man is guilty. So they put him in prison for the night, and they'll finish his trial the next day. So the next day, it says, early in the morning, right away. So the people who are against Jesus want to do this quickly before the common people can be there, because common people get up and they do their chores in the morning. While they're doing that, they've gotten together these people who are opposed to Jesus, and they're going to railroad him at his trial. So they bring him in. Jews can't execute somebody. They have to have Roman authority to do that. So they bring in Pilate, who we know was governor from the year 26 to 36. Pilate has some questions with Jesus. He doesn't say much. The crowd once says, "Crucify him." We have the story of Barabbas being released. They have a custom where on the Passover one person can be released. So they let Barabbas go instead. Pilate, apparently reluctantly, eventually hands Jesus over because he fears the crowd. His number one job is to maintain law and order. If he doesn't, he gets in trouble with his superiors in Rome. So rather than having a riot, he gives in to the people that want Jesus dead, and he hands him over for crucifixion. First, he's scourged to the pillar. Then they put a crown of thorns on his head. He has to carry his cross to the place where he will be crucified, that is, nailed to the cross until he dies. That's a painful process. It takes a few hours. We read through that as if it happens very quickly, and I'm going through it now as if it happens very quickly, but it's a painful process. Carrying your cross after you've been whipped 40 times. I mean, he's in terrible physical shape. He has to carry the cross, and knowing that he's going to be nailed to it in a little bit. He gets there. By nailed to it, pounded through his flesh, pounded through his wrist and feet. And he's hung on it until he suffocates and dies, which takes a few hours. So it's several hours of, at least 3 hours anyway, of torture on the cross, let alone the torture of being whipped and having to carry the cross. So anyway, it talks again about the crowd fulfilling what Jesus said, mocking him. Some of Isaiah, the suffering servant psalm that I talked about from Isaiah a couple weeks ago, is fulfilled here. Then it says, at noon he's on the cross already. At about 3 o'clock it says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Some people might say, oh, it's Jesus giving up his faith in God here. If you go to Psalm 22, you can do that. That's what Jesus is quoting, the first line from Psalm 22. But if you go on and read the rest of the psalm, especially verse 25, you hear that you believe God will vindicate you. So by saying this psalm, just like you saying the first verse of a song, we probably know what the rest of it is. So at the end of the psalm, there is faith that God will be with the one who's been condemned. So that's Jesus' last words here. And in Mark's gospel, it says the 3 people with him when he dies are Mary Magdalene, another Mary, and then Salome. You wonder who Salome is? That is the mother of James and John. So it's evening, Friday evening. The Sabbath begins Friday night. Remember, for Jews, Sabbath is from sunset on Friday night until sunset Saturday night. Can't do any work in that time. So quickly, they take his body and get it ready for burial. And these 3 ladies help. By the way, what is the climax? Remember last week, the climax of part 1 was Jesus saying, "Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am?" Peter saying, "I believe you're the Messiah." The climax of the second part is Jesus dying on the cross. And when he does, the climax of Mark's gospel is chapter 15, verse 39. The centurion, so it's not a Jew, centurion, works for the Romans, one of the guards, one of the soldiers, saw Jesus breathe his last and said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So again, it's unnamed people are the good people, it seems like, in Mark's gospel. Just some centurion, just like some woman, some man. All right, some guy says, truly this man was the Son of God, so he is the first one to come to belief when Jesus dies. The three women prepare the body for burial. Joseph of Arimathea, is one that is mentioned. He comes and says the body can be put in my tomb, my place. So they do that. Somebody asked how many nails did they use to nail Jesus to the cross. I would say definitely one in each hand, obviously, or one in each wrist, perhaps one big one in the legs, so probably 3. Possibly 4, but probably 3. Anyway, so the body is prepared for burial, and that's it. It's Friday night. We got to get home quickly before the sun is down. And the reason they don't come back Saturday is it's the Sabbath. And then Saturday night it's dark, so they can't come back, so they're going to come back Sunday morning to finish the body for burial. So, chapter 16, the Sabbath is over. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome, they come to the tomb again, and they're wondering about rolling back the entrance to the tomb, but it already is. And it says there's someone clothed in a white robe who says, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, the crucified. He has been raised. He is not here." All right, and then it says, go to Galilee. That's a prediction that's not quite fulfilled here in Mark yet. It is in the other 3 Gospels. The women went out and fled from the tomb, seized with trembling and bewilderment. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They were afraid, and that is how this gospel ends. They are afraid. So Mark is asking us, how about you? Are you afraid to proclaim Jesus? Or are you going to do like they did later on and actually go out and tell people? Are you afraid? So many times that "do not be afraid" is said by people in the Bible, by angels or whoever, but do not be afraid. But it says the original witnesses were afraid and they didn't say anything to anyone. Mark's gospel ends there at chapter 16, verse 8. When I was in seminary, we were taught, well, we think that there was an original ending that maybe has been lost. Others say, well, Mark deliberately ended it there so that you, the reader of the time, could be placed into the position of the women. What are you going to do? Are you afraid? Are you afraid, people of Mark's time who are suffering in Rome, are you afraid to proclaim Jesus? Because you can be put to death for doing so. Could you be that afraid? And so some people say, no, he deliberately ends his gospel on that note, so that we can ask ourselves that question. And then, who are we like? Are we like the apostles who were often afraid, who were afraid and ran away when he was arrested? Are we afraid like the women when they don't know what to make of the tomb being empty? So who are we like in this story? Or are we like some of the unnamed heroes of faith and trust that we've encountered throughout the story? All right, so that's the end of Mark's gospel. Now, many of you are going to say, well, wait a minute, now there's 12 more verses here. Yeah, those were put on later because many people were bothered by the fact that it ended the way it did. So what they do is they simply put appearances that are in the other gospels and put them here. So one is Mary Magdalene. Okay, Mary Magdalene is the one that Jesus appears to in John's gospel. So we have the appearance to her in verses 9, 10, and 11. Where she goes and sees the tomb empty and goes and tells others, but they don't believe yet. Verses 12 and 13, he appeared to 2 other people walking along. That's from Luke's gospel, the story of the 2 men on their way to Emmaus that Jesus appeared to. So we have that there. And then we have the commissioning, verses 14 and following. Jesus says, go into the whole world and proclaim the gospel. That's from Matthew. So at the conclusion of Mark's gospel, we have 3 things that were put on later on from the other 3 Gospels. The appearance to Mary Magdalene, as from John. The appearance to 2 disciples on the road, as in Luke. Commissioning of the 11 remaining apostles, as in Matthew. And then a little inspiration there about you'll be able to do great things. The part about Son of Man, you'll see him in Galilee, yeah, that's not fulfilled until we read it in the other Gospels. Mark doesn't conclude that part, but the others do. The other thing that's to be fulfilled yet is the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the kingdom. That either hasn't happened yet or happens only when we go to heaven. So after, you might have in your gospel, it might say at the end, the shorter ending. So somebody, rather than the 3 parts that I just had there, just says, after this they reported to Peter's companions. Jesus himself then appeared to others and set them forth to go and continue his mission. So other people did put that on there, but you can, I guess, do what you prefer there with that. You can conclude it with Mark leaving it as, what are you going to do now? Are you afraid? Or do you believe? Or you can put on, and our church obviously said these other parts that were put on later from the other Gospels, they're fine too, because they are corroborated in the other Gospels. So Jesus did appear to them afterwards. But it's a very quick ending. So the highlight of the Gospel is obviously Jesus' death. And the reason for that is people are dying because of their faith at the time Mark did this writing. So we believe Mark probably wrote this in Rome, probably sometime in the late 60s or around the year 70 when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. There's no more Jewish sacrifice. Jewish religion as we know it comes to an end really in the year 70. The Jewish faith has to make adjustments after that to the new things that have happened in the Roman Empire. And now from that though we have a new beginning, and that beginning is for the believers in Jesus. And it starts with the women that find the tomb empty. Do they understand? Do we understand, or are we afraid? Are we afraid or willing to go out and continue what Jesus began? That is Mark's Gospel. So, thank you for tonight. I will tell you that for next week, we'll take a look at Matthew's Gospel. Now, that's the longest one, so we won't do it all in one night, but I will tell you to skim through it. If all you know about Jesus is in Mark's Gospel, there are some remaining questions. So Matthew and Luke are going to answer some of those questions in the Gospel that they tell. One thing that I will ask you to read for next week, though, is chapter 5, 6, and 7. If you have the Gospel with Jesus' words in red, you'll notice those chapters will all be in red. It's Jesus' main teachings. So remember, Mark didn't focus a lot on what Jesus taught, other than some of the examples I gave you tonight about avoiding self-interest and possessions and self-righteousness and those sorts of things. But remember, we did say that there's another source that was available to gospel writers at the time. Matthew and Luke made use of that source, which we call a Q today. And anyway, that is why we will hear a lot about what Jesus taught in those 2 Gospels. So for next week, 2 things. One is Matthew going to fill in other details that Mark didn't? And secondly, what did Jesus teach? So we'll take a look specifically in the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, and then some of the parables that Jesus told. Remember, there's only a couple of them in Mark's Gospel. Sower and the seed, we'll hear that again. Vineyard, during his last week, which got people upset, which we heard tonight. But that's about it, not many more. Dozens of parables in Matthew and Luke as opposed to just a handful in Mark. So next, whereas Mark told us what did Jesus do? Climax of part 1, who do you say that I am? Climax of part 2, centurion saying, truly this was the Son of God, and the women saying, boy, we're afraid, what do we do? So what do we do? That's Mark's Gospel. Now Matthew and Luke are going to teach us what Jesus taught us. So I hope you had a good evening with that. We had some good questions I answered that you had along the way. So I will probably see you the same way next Wednesday night. And our plan is to go back to next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, and we'll see what Matthew has to share with us about Jesus' teachings and some other things that weren't included in Mark. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.